Welcome to Politics Now, where we are trying to bring you interviews with all of the candidates running for president. Tonight we have a very special guest, Mayor Pete Buttigieg from the city of South Bend, Indiana. Thank you for being there, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right in with the subject came up in the last debate, and that is guns. There was a little set-to with you and former Congressman Beto O'Rourke from Texas when you queried him about his plan to get rid of assault rifles. He said famously in another debate, hell yeah, we're going to come and take your guns. And you asked him, frankly, how are you going to do that? First of all, let me ask you this. Do you think we ought to ban assault rifles for civilian use?
I do. I carried a weapon in the military that's highly similar to what is available for sale in the form of an AR-15 here, and I don't see a reason why that should be sold today in America, especially knowing what we know. And there's an opportunity not only to deliver a better policy when it comes to access to new sales of high-capacity magazines and assault rifles, but also common sense measures that the vast majority of the American people want, including most Republicans, like universal background checks, closing these loopholes that are out there, red flag laws that can disarm domestic abusers and make sure that if a family member is concerned that somebody is an extreme risk, they can do something about that. We have a strong American majority for these reforms. I believe we need to engage that majority and get something done, because for far too long it's just been talk.
Do you think it could happen legally, a ban on assault rifles? There are different candidates who say they would do it with the executive order. Some say they'll do it with legislation. Given the state of our judiciary and the state of the jurisprudence, is that even legally possible to ban assault rifles? I
think so. I mean, if you think about the framework of the U.S. Constitution, right, the Second Amendment is there. It recognizes that there are certain boundaries. If you just think about it for a minute, everybody's allowed to have a slingshot. Nobody's allowed to have a nuclear weapon, right? So somewhere in between a water balloon and a Predator drone, we're going to draw a line on the sort of thing you can buy as a civilian in the United States. And all we're arguing is that we draw that line a little bit tighter in order to save lives in American houses of worship and shopping centers and schools.
So back to the original question, if we do that, if that successfully happens, it stands up to legal scrutiny, how would you get the guns that are already in circulation?
Well, that's a separate question, and that's the one where I don't think that anybody's put forward a comprehensive solution. What I do know is that we have this strong American majority to at least ban the sale of these high-capacity magazines and new weapons, in addition to those other measures I talked about, like the background checks, that of themselves can save thousands and thousands of lives. And I want to make sure we maintain the discipline to get that done as we work to find as many measures as possible that are going to lawfully and responsibly save American lives.
You have said famously that you're for Medicare for all who want it, but that you want to allow that certain health programs that are in place now, health insurance that's in place now, including that fought for by unions, to remain in place. Let me ask you this. Ultimately, do you think the United States, like all other major countries, is going to end up with a single-payer system?
I think that will happen if this public alternative that I'm proposing we create is better than all of the others. I guess what I'd say is, if that happens, that's not a bad thing. But the way I see it, we create this version, what I call Medicare for all who want it. We let anybody buy into it if they want, but we're not going to kick anybody off their private plan. I'm thinking about folks like the culinary workers here in Las Vegas, a lot of union members and others who have negotiated private plans that they like and don't want to be told that we're going to just demand that they switch over. Now, if folks like me are right, that this public plan we create is really going to be the best of all, well, then everybody eventually is going to choose it freely. If, on the other hand, for some people it's not the best option, well, then we're going to be really glad that we didn't kick them off the plans they had. So one way or the other, it'll either be a glide path to single payer or it'll be part of a mixed system. But what we know is it's going to be a lot better than what we have today.
Yeah, this debate over the Medicare for all versus building on the Affordable Care Act, or as you mentioned, a two-tiered system. Why is that important as we go forward?
Well, I think it's important because it reveals our priorities, and it shows whether we're willing to put forward plans that we can fully explain. One of the problems with some of the other plans that are out there, I'm thinking about Senator Warren's plan that's Medicare for all, whether you want it or not, is that there's been no explanation of how to pay for it. As a matter of fact, there's a hole amounting to several trillion any way that we've seen the math on how to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an important...
Despite your best efforts. I mean,
we've definitely run some numbers on it.
You tried to get an answer to that question.
And we're making sure that we're clear about the math on our own plan because voters want to know. So I think it's just a good example of a respectful but important, honest policy difference that we have that helps explain how the different candidates come at the world. And the way I come at it is we can do very big things, whether it's around healthcare, guns, college affordability, immigration, all these areas where we need reform. Climate is a big one. We can do very big things, and we can do it in a way that unifies the American people. And that's much better than an approach that would polarize the American people even further than we already are.
Yeah.
It's why I'm always asking Americans to think about that first day after the Donald Trump presidency ends, because we're running to be the president that first day. And in picking up the pieces, I believe as president it will be very important for me not only to deliver these big, bold solutions, but to do it in a way that we can bring a majority of the American people along.
You're here tonight. Part of your itinerary is to speak to the group Battleborn Progress. You consider yourself a progressive. Labels are thrown around a lot in these campaigns. What does that really mean? What do you mean by progressive?
You know, I got to tell you, these ideological labels, I think, mean less and less each passing year. I think I've got the boldest answers of any candidate in terms of my commitment to many democratic reforms, but there are other candidates who want to go further than I do in terms of spending and in terms of some of these, what have turned into, I think, purity tests in the debate. I guess I'm for what makes sense, and I think a lot of times that would be considered a very progressive approach, but I also think that we can build an American majority around each of the things I believe we should do. And these ideological labels, I think they're useful sometimes as a shorthand in the media, but I'm not sure they're really helping voters understand the most important question in every election, which is, how is my life going to be different if you get elected versus this other person? And that's the set of questions I'm trying to answer with our campaign.
And not to dwell in these labels, but who do you think has a better chance of defeating Donald Trump? Because that's one of the central questions of the Democratic nominating process. A more progressive candidate or a more pragmatic, more moderate candidate?
Well, I'll say this. There are a lot of folks who voted for the Republican candidate last time, voted for Donald Trump, or used to vote Republican, but maybe sat out the last election, and they're looking for a new place to go. Of course, President Trump has his base, but that's not most Americans. And there are a lot of moderates and a lot of Republicans who I think are seeking an alternative because they're disgusted by what is being done in the name of their party. And I think, without pretending to be anything we're not, there is a way for us to welcome people who have maybe some different ideas, but are willing to be part of that majority to get something done. And it's very important that we not push them away at this moment when our country is so polarized, so divided, but also so ready to undertake big solutions in areas where, for the majority of my adult life, there's been only talk and fighting.
Let's talk a little bit about age. You're a young guy, obviously. How should voters, you know, the answer always is, well, that's something for the voters to decide. How should the voters weigh that issue? You say on your website, we cannot find greatness in the past. Our country needs a fresh start. You're probably talking about ideas there, not people. But how should voters weigh that factor when they're weighing all the other factors that go into a candidate? Well,
I think depending on the individual, a candidate of any age might turn out to be the right answer. But I will say that coming from a new generation, I think gives me a perspective that is useful at a time like this, belonging to the generation of people who made up the bulk of the troops who were deployed after 9/11, including me. Belonging to the generation that grew up with these mass shootings and school shootings as the norm. Belonging to the generation that will have to deal with the consequences of the national debt if we don't do something about it, which is why I think my party needs to speak about that issue more. The generation with so much on the line when it comes to climate change. It gives me a sense of urgency about the future because I am hoping to be here in the 2050s when a lot of our goals around things like climate will have come and gone, to see and be held accountable for whether we succeeded in our time right now to set up a better future.
You mentioned earlier your military service. You were a lieutenant in the Navy, an intelligence officer. You deployed to Afghanistan, and you said that you joined up because you saw the disparity between communities with a lot of people who went to serve in communities where virtually no one has gone to serve. You go around America, it is not a country that seems like it's on a war footing or is even consciously aware of a war, even though we've had troops deployed for decades. I guess my question is, how essential is it for a commander-in-chief to either have military service or not? Is that something, it's not required by the Constitution, right, but is that something that you think would be an essential part of it?
Well, I certainly think it's helpful if you've had the experience of having your life changed by orders from an American president. It gives you a certain sense of the weight of that office, of what's at stake in these choices that this president seems to make on a freewheeling basis over a phone call or a tweet, but that have the lives of American troops in the balance. I also think we need to get back to a norm of service across the country, whether it's military or not. I get that military service isn't for everybody, but one of the reasons why I've proposed we create 1 million paid voluntary national service opportunities a year is that I want more Americans to have the experience of serving with others who might be very different from them, but you get to know each other, and that can help at a time when our social fabric is so torn apart right now. You know, I think about the people I served with, and we were very different backgrounds, definitely different politics, but we learned how to trust each other with our lives. I want all Americans to be able to have that same sense of connection without having to go to war in order to get there.
Interesting. You have said you're going to be touring, by the way, tomorrow, some marijuana facilities here in Nevada. You know, as you know, we've legalized both medical and recreational marijuana, one of a few states to kind of get into that new regulatory scheme. There's been some struggles along the way. You have said that you want drug possession decriminalized across the board for all drugs. In light of the opioid crisis, in light of the deaths from fentanyl and things like that, is that a good idea?
Well, there are a whole number of steps we've got to take when it comes to the opioid crisis, something that hit my community very hard. But I think another thing we've learned over recent years and decades is you can't arrest your way out of a problem like what's going on with drugs in this country. And on the contrary, we've seen case after case where incarceration has wound up doing more harm than the offense that it was intended to deal with. And we know that there are a lot of racial disparities in terms of who is incarcerated, even for comparable offenses. So I don't take lightly what goes on when it comes to the impact that drugs can have on people. But I also think that we need to learn from the failures of the war on drugs. And a better approach is to recognize that addiction is effectively a medical issue that can very often be treated by medical means, and to concentrate our law enforcement efforts in other areas like violence prevention, where we know it could make a big difference.
Yeah. I can't let you leave without addressing a couple of Nevada issues. I'm sure you've heard of the Yucca Mountain project. There's nuclear waste at plants across the country. I don't think any in Indiana, but in nearby states, certainly in Illinois. Yucca Mountain's been proposed. Nevada has resisted it. What's your position on that as president? Would you sign off on proceeding with at least the study of Yucca Mountain to be the appropriate place to dump nuclear waste?
Well, I won't sign off on anything that doesn't include the right kind of consent-based process with the people of Nevada, and I'm strongly against this administration's effort to go around that. And it seems like not even consult local officials with some of these moves. Look, the problem of how to handle this kind of waste is complex, and a lot of different ideas have been put forward, from making sure there are safer methods for on-site storage to other forms of storage that we might develop in the future. But what I'm sure of is that asking one community or one state to shoulder this burden without ensuring that there's a level of consent there is not fair, not wise, and it's not what you'll see in my administration.
Even if the places, the people who are living next to nuclear power plants now are much more numerous than the state of Nevada. Nevada's always fought this, probably always will fight this. If it's a consent-based process, I don't think it's coming to Nevada. But at some point, as a nation, do the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few?
Well, what we've got to do, I think, is continue developing options that are going to be safe. The safer they are, the more likely we'll be able to get the kind of consent that we need. And there are technological questions, there are policy questions, and there are justice questions at stake. What I know is that just dictating the answer from Washington and telling some folks somewhere, too bad, here it comes, is not going to lead to a good solution for the long run.
I know you're tight on time, so let me ask you just one last question, and that is on Syria. You've been in that part of the world, you've served in that part of the world at peril of shot and shell. Would you have left American troops in Syria and not withdrawn them as President Donald Trump did?
I would absolutely not have done what this president did. The damage is not just what's happening in Syria, where we've seen that the removal of just a handful of highly specialized, highly capable American troops has now led to a descent into chaos. But also, what has happened to American credibility around the world is going to take years to recover from. Look, one of the things that I felt kept me safe when I was deployed was the knowledge that the flag on my shoulder represented a country known to keep its word, that our allies and our enemies knew that we would do what we said we would do, and that if you put your life on the line to fight alongside us, we were going to have your back. The president has destroyed that sense of loyalty by betraying our Kurdish allies, and that's going to make it that much more dangerous for future U.S. troops trying to recruit allies to help in fights who knows where around the world, especially these kinds of small and asymmetric conflicts that are probably going to continue to characterize security environments in the 21st century. It is the exact wrong moment to do something like this. And if we really want to keep the peace, if we really want to stay out of full-scale conflicts and getting sucked into another major endless war with ground troops, we better be smart about how to keep the peace. And that makes sure that means making sure that we engage with our allies, that we engage the international community, and that above all, that the word of the United States can be trusted.
But doesn't, just to play devil's advocate for a second, doesn't Donald Trump, and oddly dovetailing with some of the more liberal members of the Democratic Party, do they not have a point when they warn about, just as you said, endless wars? I mean, you're a veteran. You have been over there, so you know what it's like from the ground up. Do they not have a point about, we'll be over there, and once we're there, we have to stay forever? I mean, that doesn't seem to be a long-term viable solution.
Well, our job is not to guarantee peace and prosperity in every country in the Middle East or anywhere else. Our job is to keep American lives safe. But if this withdrawal leads to, as we're starting to see, a new empowerment of ISIS, we could wind up being sucked in at a greater scale and at greater peril to American lives. See, they've got it exactly upside down in this White House. It's actually a small, lean, highly specialized, highly mobile kind of force that would be the way not to have massive ground troops in a place like Afghanistan. But here you had a really good example of what a very small number of highly focused U.S. Special operators can do. And the moment you pulled that out, we saw the chaos that is surrounding them. Look, some of these issues are going to be very difficult for the next president to manage. But I will be a commander-in-chief who ensures that we never introduce U.S. force when there's any good alternative, and that we make sure that we wisely take steps to protect the American homeland so that we're not in the situation of having to fight with large numbers, whether it's right here at home if there's an attack here, or getting entangled once again abroad because we failed to do the right thing to keep the peace in the first place.
Sounds great. Well, South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, candidate for president in 2020, thank you so much for taking the time to come down, and good luck. Stay safe on the campaign trail.
Thank you. Good to be with you.